Good morning. My name is Betsy Corcoran. I'm CEO and co-founder of EdSurge, and I'm really delighted to welcome you and a terrific panel of experts to today's webinar. Our topic today is how micro-credentials can boost professional learning. And we've got a lot of great thoughts and experiences that we're keen to share, and we want to make this a very interactive experience. Quick note before we start, this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available to you after the live event. So we encourage you to be a part of this, to ask questions using the Q&A button on the Zoom webinar window that should be down at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to take them as we're having the conversation because we really do want to make you part of this conversation. So feel free to jump in, log a question, and then we'll try to integrate that into our conversation. So let's get started. I want to first introduce and thank our panelists for joining us today. First, we're joined by Jennifer Kabacher, who's Director of Educator Microcredentials at Digital Promise. Jennifer comes to Digital Promise from KIPP LA Schools, which is, of course, a high-performing charter management organization in Los Angeles. She managed corporate and foundation relationships, led external engagement efforts to engage the schools and the students with the tools that they need to succeed. And she also worked at two Washington, D.C. think tanks, the New America Foundation and the Urban Institute, and wrote and researched issues around federal funding, policy, and education reform. Great. Next up, we have Justin Bruno. Justin is a professional learning services manager at Michigan Virtual. He was a teacher. He is an enthusiastic leader of modern, efficient learning experiences for everyone. And he was also a senior research and policy associate with Michigan Virtual LRI, MVLRI, and most importantly, worked as an 8th grade social studies teacher in his home state of Louisiana. So welcome, Justin. We also have with us Ken Durkin, who is director of the online professional learning program at Michigan Virtual. And Ken has been at this for 15 years. He's been working to create technology solutions to help in the virtual world and has done everything from virtual worlds, mobile apps, new media. And so he is our serious technology jock here. And finally, we have Chris Sessoms, who's a learning strategies consultant with D2L. But most importantly, has been a longtime educator. He has served as a faculty member, researcher, administrator at Johns Hopkins School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley, University of Florida, and also was in the classroom for a long period of time. So first, thank you all very, very much for being with us. Okay, so let's start with a couple of quick statistics. These are statistics, there we go. These have been pulled from the 2014 report, which many of you may be familiar with. It was done by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation called Teachers Know Best. And what they found is no surprise to anybody who's been in a school, which is that some of the biggest barriers around professional learning involve time and resources. And there's another issue at play too. According to the same report, the common types of professional learning that are the least popular among teachers are things that we use all the time. And so that starts with the very broad question, which is we know that professional development, professional learning is probably maybe the single most important thing to success in the classroom, in schools. And so figuring out how we move to better professional development, stuff that is meaningful to teachers and also produces outcomes is pretty fundamental. So Jennifer, let's start with you and we'll go down the way. What have we learned about the kind of professional development that is really making a difference for educators everywhere?
It's a fantastic question and such an important entry point into this greater conversation around micro-credentials because they, at their core, are about highlighting and elevating teacher voice and choice in the professional learning market. So in 2015, Digital Promise did a nationally representative survey of educators across the country and found that educators now more than ever are engaging in a whole new type of professional learning that we rarely ever talk about. And that is all these informal learning activities, anything from Twitter chats to YouTube videos and I say this somewhat jokingly, but it is very real, blood, sweat, and tears and trial and error in their classroom. And we rarely shine a light on those types of learning, and they are becoming more and more powerful. And we're finally also able to do some research on the impact of those. And we know that educators find them to be exciting, to be empowering, and to be accessible anytime and any place. And those are all pieces that our survey found and that anecdotally we've collected since then are really valuable to educators in the more and more demanding environments that they experience.
Great. So that's a great starting point, and we're going to come back to elements of what micro-credentials mean. Ken, take us into Michigan. You guys have been at this for a long time. What have you learned about how teachers are best learning?
Well, I think in Michigan, we've been at doing online professional development since 2004. So we've learned a lot over that time. But we also do a lot of face-to-face professional development as well, focusing on integrating technology into instruction, so blended learning. And what we've learned is that teachers really struggle with kind of the implementation of any new idea, and there's that implementation dip as they work through that we need kind of sustained help for these teachers as we go along. And the problem is sustaining that help over any period of time becomes almost cost prohibitive. And so how do we use technology to really help facilitate teachers getting access to the help they need, getting the just-in-time access, and really, as was pointed out, access to things that they have choice in, problems that they're dealing with every day that they can work towards helping solve them with the professional learning needs that's at their fingertips, that they can get access to digitally on their mobile devices, on their laptops. That's what we need, just because the idea of pulling everybody out of their classrooms and getting them in front of a world-renowned speaker even becomes more complicated every day, and problems that are happening in classrooms are so differentiated that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. So struggling with that gap between what we can do to help individual educators in their personalized development versus kind of other things that we deal with in terms of statewide policies that we want to see implemented at scale is really the space that we try to navigate at Michigan Virtual.
That's great. And we're going to come back to a program that you've just kicked off around math learning that speaks to some of these questions as well. And also come back to the question of cost, which is pretty fundamental. Chris, you've been on both sides of it. You've been the educator. You have been on the side of creating professional development. What did you love as a teacher, and what do you love now?
Well, I'm so happy to echo what Jennifer mentioned, which is I think the most important part that I found in studying teacher professional development is professionalizing the profession, like professionalizing teaching. And that was a real important part of it, by capturing teacher voice was really critical. And I'm so happy to see the work that's going on today that's focusing on that. But one of the things I've seen is the state of, I'll say, informal self-directed learning is really strong. You know, with the internet and all the resources that are available to us today, both good and bad, it's really strong. But I think the real challenge that I'm seeing today is to, how do we determine the best way to formalize or recognize or maybe credential that learning? That seems to be the real rub right now that we're seeing.
And in fact, let me break that down into two questions. And then Justin, I'd really love to have you jump in and share some of your experiences as well. You said, how do we recognize and credential the learning? How do we know the learning's happening? I mean, what kind of learning are we seeing? Maybe Justin, let me pull you into the conversation this moment. What are examples that you've seen of, again, starting very broadly, online learning that works and online learning that doesn't work?
Sure. Well, I think most of us are probably familiar with the term sit and get, and something that none of us really want to find ourselves, unfortunately, being a part of in terms of professional development. And all too often, I think the online model can be even a sit and get model. When we talk about kind of compliance training or training that's like click and get, where you're just kind of clicking through slides and going through things and not really taking out valuable lessons that you can apply to a classroom, right? And so what I think has been really impactful for me as a teacher, as well as now on the side of the house developing professional learning here at Michigan Virtual, thinking about ways to actually pull expertise from the folks who are doing it on a day-to-day basis and connecting them with one another. We work with folks who serve in a number of different positions in schools in Michigan who are very isolated in what they do and running different online learning programs or other different teaching opportunities, and they have not a great way of sharing that expertise with one another. And so how do we build effective learning environments for that teaching or for that learning to be seamless and that sharing to be seamless? And how do we kind of honor, as Jennifer mentioned, that informal learning process and really formalize it and value it and not just have things be kind of like a rote process or experience for teachers?
So that is a fantastic jump off point to me asking you guys some of the tough questions, which is, okay, give me an example. Let's talk about a couple of examples that you folks have seen of a time when you have really successfully seen the use of online learning, and that successful means exactly what Justin's just set up for us, right? Which is that it's connected to what's going on in the classroom and the teachers feel it's really valuable. So I'd love to hear a success story, and, you know, candidly, I'm a journalist. I'd love to hear a time when it didn't quite turn out the way you wanted it to go. Chris, can you start us off here?
Oh boy, would I love to. One of my favorite success stories, I can do a success story, was utilizing the online space to support a community of practice around a train the trainers model. So using the online space to support the community as it was both learning how to conduct, in this case, action research, and then teach others how to conduct the action research. So it became a place where we could both a place to teach from, as well as a place to then launch and help others to teach from. So it was a really rigorous process, and it took a lot of setup, a lot of thought, but it was a great success.
And just take a moment and talk about what were some of the conditions that made it successful, because a couple of the folks here jumping in online, and we're going to get to start pulling your questions, is, you know, okay, so you want to have examples of learning, you want to have artifacts, you want to have specific things. So talk for a moment, Chris, about a couple of the things that proved crucial in making that a success, and then would love to have other people jump in with examples, good or bad.
So two real, off the top of my head, real important factors were, for this community to be successful, we needed ground rules. We need a really clear set of rules of what the expectations were for participants, for those participating in it, as well as what the deliverables were going to look like. And all that had to be defined well in advance of even getting started. And then we also had to have some buy-in as part of those ground rules and opportunities for participants to add to those rules to make sure that we had everybody working together. And then finally, the thing that really pulls it all together is to have a really strong, I'll call it educative leader, somebody that really understands how to facilitate that process of working people through a problem-based kind of scenarios.
Great.
Jennifer? Yeah, I'd love to jump in here. So at this point, Digital Promise has worked with upwards of 15 at this point, school districts across the country and several states as well, to implement microcredentials. And what we've essentially done there, to a certain extent, is remain agnostic as to where and how an educator learned a skill, but instead supported the district or state in explicitly focusing on what the skills are that they want their educators to demonstrate, to know and be able to do, and to align those skills with their stated priorities. So one of the things that we found is key to success is what I refer to as bounded choice. Digital Promise's microcredential platform currently offers over 300 different microcredentials that an educator could choose from that are all focused on very specific research-backed skills. It is exceptionally overwhelming to give an educator access to all 300 and say, go figure it out what you need. But we found that if districts or states narrow down to maybe 20 to 25, educators are great at knowing their learning needs, but they do need that bounded choice to help them focus on what is of greatest priority for their state or district is one thing we found. As an example of one of those district implementations, we worked with Baltimore County Public Schools. They engaged about 200 of their educators in a pilot of microcredentials, facilitated it primarily via webinars and Twitter chats, and had just hundreds of educators all come together around the 25 or so microcredentials they identified to work together either in pairs or in PLCs to pursue these skills and to really become empowered to learn and practice them in the ways that were most effective or resonant for the individual educators, and then ultimately earn the microcredentials. One of the really other interesting challenges I think that we found here is that teachers are really used to that sit and get mentality around professional learning. So it's sort of, if you show up, it is, and it's done. And so there's definitely a mentality switch for the educators that was necessary, because earning a microcredential turns out to be fairly hard. They are rigorous, and a lot of teachers may not earn them the first time around. And so getting the teachers in that growth mindset of being willing to have a microcredential denied, go back and resubmit and earn again definitely takes time. But we see more and more from the data or the surveys that we collect from educators that the feedback that they receive and that process is super beneficial for them to think of themselves as learners as well.
Super interesting. And you've raised a couple of points. Ken and Justin, I want to get to you guys for a moment and talk about the program that you're designing really right now and been rolling out for teachers in Michigan. But just a couple of little questions in here. First, does Digital Promise support middle schools in microcredentials as well?
Absolutely. So we have, I mentioned, over 300 microcredentials on our platform, and the vast majority of them are targeted to educators across content areas, across grade levels. And we also have microcredentials not just for classroom teachers, but for educators more broadly defined. So administrators, coaches, librarians, et cetera, et cetera. We're really trying to build a system that meets the needs of all adults in the school building.
Super. And one of the things that we may do after this webinar is done for everyone who's listening in is pull together some additional resources on reference points for microcredentials and share those out. But we wanted to kind of drive this conversation and then pull together the resources and share those. One of the other questions that has come up just quickly here is a seal of distinction. This is going to be a really important question to come back to because, okay, Digital Promise, you're super well known nationwide, embossed by a congressional seal. That's terrific. But there's also a lot of other microcredentials out there, and having some sense of, well, okay, which ones do I trust and which ones do I not trust? Is a really big deal. So I say something about that quickly, but then I really want to move to Michigan and hear how you guys are building your program out.
Yeah, I think this is honestly one of the sort of crucial moments that we're in for microcredentials right now. And what Digital Promise has done is we've created and iterated for the last 4 years now on a template and framework for what we believe defines a high quality microcredential. And I think of it as 3 pillars. One is that they're research backed. 2 is that they're evidence-based, and 3 is that they're assessment-based. So any microcredential you see out there in the world that has a DP in the bottom left-hand corner, it complies with that template and framework, and it has actually been part of the development process where Digital Promise staff members work with staff members from the issuing organizations to develop that microcredential, iterate on it, and ensure that it complies with that template. So we do a lot of quality control there. As time passes, I think it'll be interesting to see as more microcredentials enter the market, the degree to which they reflect some of our priorities or do not, and how the value is distributed among those accordingly.
Sweet. Ken and Justin, tell us a little bit about the program that you guys have been building. Again, you come with this huge background of 15 years of doing online education, and now you're actually creating a microcredential program around math tools. Tell us a little bit about what's gone into that and what are, again, some of the fundamentals. Chris gave us a couple of ground rules. Jennifer's given us a few more. What's been crucial as you built out your program?
I think Jennifer hit the nail on the head when she said it's a challenge for educators to get into any sort of kind of competency-based professional learning. It's not the model that you're used to. It's not how ed policy is set up for licensing. And so when you ask somebody to step out of that box and really engage in a way in which they're trying to implement their learning in their classrooms, provide evidence, show artifacts of their competency, it is really quite a challenge and a stretch. Now there's obviously high flyers who are really interested in the whole improvement process, but for a teacher on the ground every day, and especially in Michigan where we're dealing with some serious issues around early literacy, we are sliding backwards in terms of our literacy rates. It gets really tense around what teachers have time to manage. So that job embedded piece of microcredentials plays a really important role of how can it be something that you're doing that's a problem that you're trying to address, that you're producing artifacts from your everyday interactions. We built a program to kind of test this water that we called MyPD, which was meant to be a way to honor informal learning. There's a lot of research around the fact that mastery comes from a huge amount of informal learning that's not recognized through most credentials, and I think that's where microcredentials really play a strong role in the sense of how do you honor that informal learning. In Michigan, we don't have the policy environment yet where we have microcredentials being readily recognized, so we built out a program that was more like competency light, where people define problems of practice that they're having, they come up with the resources they're using to address that problem, structure an implementation plan, try to implement, and then provide that all to us and our professional learning coaches, review it and provide feedback. And sometimes it takes multiple rounds for people to get to the point where they feel like both the professional learning coaches and the participant agree that they're in a state of proficiency, and are awarded what we call sketches in Michigan, which are state continuing education clock hours, so CEUs, which then get used for licensing reasons. So I think that's was a real challenge for educators to kind of step out of what they're used to and do that. And I think that's where I see a trend in microcredentials. Once somebody interacts in these formats, they see the benefit of it and they see the potential of it, but it's that first initial step becomes a barrier in some cases.
Chris, what have you seen about how challenging it is to get educators to a more competency-based model, which is ultimately what microcredentialing should be about?
That's a great question. I think some of the conversations I've been having with folks, specifically in the higher education area, we kind of stumble into this developing a comprehensive digital student record that really clearly articulates what students know and can do. I feel like we're still challenged by that definition, just as you pointed out earlier, Betsy, about the challenge of really defining what is a microcredential and getting buy-in across a larger, sort of scale.
What's the risk that microcredentials become a check the box thing? So for example, one of the people online says, well, what if you can demonstrate you're already proficient in a skill? Can you earn the microcredential without actually going through the coursework? And on the one hand, that might be great. I can demonstrate to you I'm super credible. On the other hand, is there a risk that I just want to like check a box, check a box, check a box? Jennifer, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so that's actually really interesting because that has highlighted, I think, what distinguishes microcredentials from a lot of other online learning concepts is that from our view, the microcredential itself is not the learning process. The microcredential is ultimately the assessment of an educator's competence. So a microcredential asks an educator to demonstrate their competence, whether it's something that they just learned how to do or something that they've been doing for 20 years. We're essentially saying that it is much more valuable to acknowledge and recognize an educator for their skills, for their expertise, for their competence in the classroom, than it is to focus on whether they spent 5 hours in this learning environment and 6 hours in that learning environment, et cetera, et cetera. We obviously care deeply about better understanding how teachers learn in the most effective ways, acknowledging that different teachers prefer to learn in different environments as well. However, the microcredential really is about validating the competence and the skill. It's not about focusing on the actual learning activity itself. So people often say a microcredential course, and I am here to try to bust that myth. The microcredential is not a course. It is, in fact, the demonstration of what an educator learned or what they're able to do, regardless of where and how they learned it.
Now you have me worried that I said microcredential course at some point, but we strongly believe that Digital Promise has a really good format that they laid out and a quality standard that we use in Michigan when we're talking about microcredentials with people. And I think that transparency of what is expected to earn that recognition of that competency or that microcredential, I think is one of the really key points of what creates the currency or value of microcredentials in the long run, because it'll be open and available for people to look at and understand. And the more transparent we make that, I think the more rewarding the experience gets for educators, because they're showing off the great work they're doing and the mastery that they've accomplished over time, but also allows us to benchmark as employers, as schools, as higher education institutes, what those microcredentials actually mean. So I just wanted to throw that in because Jennifer's stealing all my talking points that I probably stole off the Digital Promise website at one point.
That's okay. Let's talk a little bit, though. One of the folks online asks, are schools feeling that the credentials from accredited sources are the equivalent to the credentials from validated sources? So announcing something that's endorsed by the school or by some part of the school. So maybe Ken and Justin, again, give us a little bit of the sense of what you're seeing in Michigan. Are there different categories that you're really putting these credentials in, or are there some that you should just you kind of encourage people to stay away from? And anybody else can jump in too.
So Justin and I were both kind of giving each other side glances. You can see he's sitting right behind me. Like, who wants to answer that one? Accredited sources, right? Those we tend to think of higher ed institutions, and one of the problems with that is that pretty much 25% of the kind of progression to mastery happens in these formal settings. And I think what's crucial, and Jennifer was talking about this review of evidence as being part of the microcredential. How do we get those institutions that are accredited institutions involved in helping understand and vet microcredentials, train people to review microcredentials against the competencies that have been outlined? And I think that's where we start seeing this public-private kind of molding and merging. So, currently in the state of Michigan, you look at our ed associations, which are like the Michigan Association of Secondary School Principals, Association of School Administrators, Elementary and Middle School Principals Association. They're PD providers to their members. And so a lot of them do alternative certification programs. We run at Michigan Virtual the MASSP alternative cert for ed leadership. So instead of getting your ed leadership masters in a higher ed institution, you can get this alternative path that was set up by the Department of Education with MASSP, and it's fully online. And it was ahead of its time in the sense that a lot of the programs now are online for ed leadership at all the big universities, but this idea that they're basically competing, right? We're creating a competitive space. And what I'd like to see over time is how these institutions are helping provide a value and provide kind of some backing to the microcredentials that ed associations may be using, or the state may be deploying, or that other organizations may be working on. And I think that's the type of partnership that would be really valuable to educators and help kind of thread the path between what is an accredited endorsement or credential versus microcredential that you earn somewhere. That there is constant discussion about what the value of that is.
Well, it strikes me that transparency is really key here. And back to Jennifer's point about the assessment sort of driving a lot of this as well. I remember that when I first started teaching high school, the director of my school came in one day and said, don't forget, assessment drives the curriculum. And I almost, kind of cried. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm an English teacher. My papers drive the curriculum. And then I had to step back and really unpack that, what she was really talking about. And I realized she was right. What I'm asking students to do to perform, to demonstrate competency, what are the benchmarks? What am I holding them to? If those aren't clear, then we're all in trouble. So I think this also points to that wicked problem that we always see around the college credential, that we used to have this debate about the online education versus face-to-face education, where the gold standard was face-to-face, but online we were forced to put our syllabus and show our discussions and show everything. It was a much different process, and I feel like we're there again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I love that point about transparency. I'm going to ask each of you kind of a thumbs up or a thumbs down question that one of the attendees said, which is, does it make the most sense for districts to manage their own micro-credential programs? If you think it makes the most sense for districts to manage their own micro-credentials, thumbs up. And if you think that, well, they're one, but gosh, there's a lot of others too, thumbs down. So thumbs up or thumbs down, folks?
I'm really struggling to do a thumbs up, thumbs down, because there are so many caveats in that, and we have some sort of thoughts. So Betsy, I guess this is to be able to
Jennifer,
at some point.
give us some of the caveats and thoughts there.
So it's really interesting. We work with districts who feel very strongly that they should define what their micro-credentials are, and that they know best what competence looks like, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's really interesting. There's some things that districts should consider there. One, that means that the districts themselves have to develop the technology and the content, and they have to assess micro-credentials. And the other thing that I think is really interesting there is it's thinking about what the value is for the educator in the long term. If an educator earns a micro-credential that's specific to their district, there's a larger question there for me about, does that micro-credential have value for the educator outside of that district? Is it reciprocal? Does it translate? The piece, and this is sort of the approach that we've taken, that micro-credentials are issued and assessed and awarded by external organizations with content expertise, means that that educator receives a piece of currency at the end of the day that has that organization's brand and currency associated with it. And that has value to the educator outside. It also means that the sort of burden of assessment is placed more on the issuing organization than on the district. That said, there have been cases where districts do use existing content, but they can have their local assessors certified to assess micro-credentials on another organization's behalf. So there's a way to sort of do both that we have explored, and I think is really interesting. But this is such a more complicated conversation, because I think districts, and we work with them a lot on this, need to figure out what their theory of change is, or what the problem is they're trying to address with micro-credentials before diving in.
What about the kind of credit that districts award for micro-credentials? In other words, as someone said here, what are some of the strategies that school districts are using to get teachers to buy in? And that would mean awarding credentials, awarding pay raises. What are we seeing about how much school districts or groups are really putting their money where their mouth is and offering substantial rewards to teachers for doing micro-credentials? And Justin, I'd love to pull you into the conversation as well. And so, if you want to share some of what you're seeing in Michigan, that would be sweet too.
Sure. I'll probably just actually tee up another talking point for Ken in my answer, but we have started like some early conversations with the Lansing Public Schools here in Lansing, Michigan, who were awarded a pretty substantial federal grant on retaining and training teachers, especially toward like more leadership positions. And as part of that grant, they're really focused on professional learning, right? Providing training for those teachers. And so they're interested in exploring different innovative ways to do that. And so as part of that conversation, we've talked about MyPD, which is more of kind of like a competency light independent study type program, but we've also we are also in development of a mobile learning application to connect teachers within buildings and within districts. We, again, are flirting with this idea of micro-credentials because we're trying to establish kind of like some statewide consistency. So going back to your earlier question, Betsy, about like whether or not a thumbs up, thumbs down on kind of like inter-district consistency, it's almost going back to Jennifer's question about what are you really trying to accomplish? What is the outcome that you're trying to achieve here? And how do those things align with different statewide initiatives? And so that's something that Michigan's really struggled with, is having everybody move in the same direction toward a common goal. And so those are the initial questions that we're working with Lansing on. Hopefully I queued that up pretty nicely for Ken to talk about the conversations that we're having with that district.
Ken, you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, so I think there's Lansing's a really good example because they've been chosen as like one of 5 cities throughout the country to really focus on how do you retain teachers. Michigan has a huge teacher mobility problem. 20% of our teachers move schools on an annual basis, which is 10% higher than the national average. And so it's a real difficulty in terms of retaining teachers, training teachers and onboarding teachers, even the hiring practice. The Department of Ed, who's done this research with an educator on loan from Harvard, has said that it's probably equivalents of $10,000 to bring a new teacher in every time a teacher is mobile. And that doesn't count attrition rates, so anybody who's promoted up or whatever. So Lansing's really trying to tackle this problem with how do you create innovative models to retain and promote teachers. I also point out that there's a district that we work with closely as a partner district called Hamilton Community Schools, and the superintendent there is pretty innovative in the sense that he's actually tried to promote the idea of earning micro-credentials as part of pay increases compared to just getting step increases. And I think that's an interesting model. I don't know how it's going to turn out or how well it's going to be adopted and how many people are going to take advantage of that over the general step increase. But I think he built that into the contractual obligations, which is pretty unique because in Michigan, our teacher association and the unionization of our faculty and academic staff is pretty high. So putting something like that in a teacher contract is pretty innovative and definitely outside the norm. And so I see schools recognizing it in that way. I think it's interesting, and I would love to hear other people's thoughts on the kind of ed policy spectrum, especially at state levels. The idea that, Tennessee has adopted micro-credentials as a way, and that's almost the gold standard in a lot of ways when people talk about like, well, why can't Michigan do it? Tennessee did it. And I know Digital Promise had a big hand in that. And so I'm just interested from a national perspective how states look at micro-credentials, because in Michigan, they have the Department of Ed is very interested in how this plays out, but the actual policy changes involved are quite complex.
Jennifer, that we teed you up perfectly. What made it work in Tennessee, and can Michigan do it, or other states? What do you see?
So this is where I make my obligatory comment about federalism and how it makes this entire conversation exceptionally challenging. Every state is so different, and that's everything from the way that things can change. Some things require legislative changes. Sometimes it's statutory, sometimes it's regulatory. Sometimes literally someone in a Department of Education office in a state can write an email and it happens. In some states, California being a great example, the state has nothing to do with professional development requirements. And so a district themselves can decide what happens. So this is, there are 14,000 school districts in America. And in some cases, this is like a one by one conversation. In some cases, it's at the state level. In some cases, it's at the education cooperative level. So it's really complicated.
So what worked in Tennessee? Tell us a little bit more about the Tennessee example, and are there any lessons the rest of us can draw from that?
Yeah, so Tennessee is being super thoughtful about micro-credentials. It's been thrilling to see. Their ultimate goal is about thinking through relicensure and whether micro-credentials could ultimately be the answer to replacing continuing education units or professional development points, I don't remember exactly what they call them in the state, as a more competency-based, meaningful way to provide relicensure for educators. In the interim, they've taken what I often think of as the low-hanging fruit step of providing those CEUs for micro-credentials that the educators earn. However, they've done it in a very thoughtful, pilot-focused way. So they've identified, I want to say it's about 200 teachers in the first year, and about 20 or so micro-credentials on very specific areas of teacher competence that were aligned with state needs and priorities, and did a lot of support with those educators in that pilot to engage in the micro-credentials. In the second year, they expanded the pilot more broadly, and they brought in school leadership, because another thing that they found is that one key to success in the micro-credential pilot is if the principals and school leaders are bought into it and are able to support both emotionally or verbally and in the actual process, their educators in participating. So I think it's that really thoughtful, slow, very communication-focused effort that's happening in Tennessee that has supported that. I see Evan O'Donnell from Teaching Matters just commented here. Teaching Matters is also working in the state of Tennessee, specifically around teacher leadership, which is a parallel pilot to the work that Tennessee is doing with Digital Promise. The two approaches to micro-credentials are a little different in that the Teaching Matters focus has sort of a professional development component built right into it, as opposed to just the micro-credentials that stand alone. So Tennessee is really walking the walk, I think, with respect to micro-credentials and taking very thoughtful, well-calculated risks in the process.
That's great. Jeff has been asking a lot of really great questions and so forth online and in the chat. And one of the questions he asked is, do we have any stats on how many people are starting a micro-credential and how many are actually finishing the micro-credential?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that we recently heard out of Tennessee is that, and it was reinforced by a pilot that happened in Rhode Island as well, that if you engage 100 teachers in a micro-credential pilot, about 50% of them are likely to actually apply for that micro-credential. So we see this sort of consistent 50% number, but it seems to be more effective when there's meaningful incentives provided to the educators. It's more effective when the supports are provided, especially from leadership, and it's most effective when there's really good communication as well. So that 50% number seems to be a thing. In terms of application, I saw that number just pop up. It varies widely by issuer and content area. Across our system, we were actually surprised to see that the average passing rate at the first try is about 55%. We expect it to be a little bit higher. However, a lot of that is also tempered by educators for whom they're doing this the first time. They're just getting used to it. As educators apply for more micro-credentials, they're more likely to earn them as well. And then similarly, if there are professional development engagements tied to those micro-credentials, success rates improve as well. We do see resubmissions are very, very common. So educators, even if they are denied the first time, are quite likely to amend their submission and try again.
That's great. Let's come to some of the technical aspects. I mean, what is it that's going to make these programs engaging? Chris, would love to have you weigh in a little bit on the, on the structure of these things. And do you have any advice? Andrea is asking us, do you have any advice on what not to do when you're building a course?
It's interesting. I wanted to, that triggered for me immediately that slide you showed earlier, Betsy, when we started out about what we think works in professional development and then what teachers actually get the most out of. Motivation is really key here, and figuring out what it is that's going to trigger folks to want to complete, and especially in something that's risky, like a new format, like a micro-credential, something they're not used to. These numbers make sense, but it strikes me that it's going to take a little bit of time. I'm curious about, is there ways we can tailor the credentialing opportunity to better fit participants' desires, if you will? Like, could I go in, and I'm picturing this down the road in maybe 5 to 10 years, I can see these kind of brokers, essentially PD brokerage, where I could go in and say, I'm looking to learn more about this specific topic, teaching a math concept, algebra concept. Then you would be able to apply, and you would be matched with a provider who would be able to say, yes, we can do this, and this is what it would look like. So you would see everything ahead of time. I think that's, Jennifer is already on that track. My guess is it's going to be a lot more as soon as I dare say the guidelines are clear for folks. But guidelines, meaning that the interoperability, I want to say, of this credential is going to fit, in my program, get me the credit, the credentialing I need and my licensure. But it strikes me, though, we have an opportunity to really personalize stuff, Betsy, here in a way that we might not have had before, given the technology can allow us to get a sense of prior knowledge, and then do some matching with that understanding.
That's a provocative picture of the future, Chris. But just one more question. I'm just kind of curious about whether you have a sense from, even from D2L, of whether there are some best practices, lessons learned in, these are the core. You got to have these three core elements, in a course or in a micro-credential if you're creating anything that statistically that you can tell us that has been learned by creating these over time.
I would have to go back and do a little bit more digging and more research on giving you real statistics, and I apologize, I didn't come prepared with those.
Sorry.
But there are, I think, some basics that we've seen in the research around professional development that we know through the years of research that are pretty consistent. That is, for example, that it's focused on the content area that you're interested in, that it's embedded within the work that you're doing, that becomes part of your work as opposed to something that's off to the separate, as we see when you're doing that compliance training, why everybody sort of loathes compliance training. It just doesn't seem to fit in what I'm doing. So when it's authentic, I think that's really the key to all learning opportunities, be it professional development or otherwise. It's the level of authenticity really drives a lot of the motivation through any of these projects.
And you keyed up a question that Bernie Trilling has asked here online, which is, well, what about student micro-credentials? I mean, would be offering some kind of recognition of the value of students' informal learning? Does that actually both help and motivate teachers? Is that something we should be doing more? Is it something that, Jennifer, in the research labs there at Digital Promise, are you thinking about student micro-credentials?
So, hi, Bernie, first of all. Bernie's a longtime partner of the Microcredentials Initiative at Digital Promise. So student microcredentials are such an interesting idea because they have so many different applications. They really started off focusing on recognition of the learning that students do outside of school. So LRNG is an organization that is trying to build a system that's city-based, where students can receive that recognition, those micro-credentials, for what they do during the summer or what they do in after-school programs. And that, I think, is really interesting as a way to shine a light and differentiate students based on what they do on their free time. Similarly, there's this idea of micro-credentials tied to student competencies that they learn in the classroom. So instead of going through an entire year of Algebra 3-4 in their junior year in high school, or whenever they take it these days, could a student earn a bunch of micro-credentials around the algebra core competencies and finish that course more quickly? Could we really go towards a competency-based learning progression system for students? I think that is a really compelling idea that requires a lot of technical and administrative and finally knowledge base to really develop and explore. You see a lot of interesting classroom-based micro-credential systems or badging systems that teachers are developing on their own to sort of get at this in a very micro, pun intended, way. But there's so much possibility there and very little opportunity, I think, for teachers and educators across the country to share what they're doing. We are not moving on this initially, or immediately, I should say, but we're really interested to see what develops and see how we can support. I could even imagine a micro-credential on educators implementing microcredentials for students.
That's pretty
Getting a
meta.
little recursive here, folks. Okay,
I,
which brings out the journalist in me, which is I've got to ask, so what are things we should be aware of? It all sounds brilliant. It sounds wonderful. My guess is there's also probably some sand traps and some things that we should avoid. Otherwise, we're going to waste people's time. We're going to waste their money. They're going to, they're not actually going to be learning. What are the things what are the warning signs that we should be careful of, that we should watch out for? And I'm going to throw that open. I won't call on anybody, but somebody jump in here.
I was going to wait for Justin to jump in. Sorry. The one of the things that I think is interesting, as sand trap, as you put it, or a pitfall, is the idea of people using what looks like a microcredential for like engagement, right? So you attended my training and you get a badge for just showing up, right? And then people say, look, I got a badge, I got a microcredential. So the work that Jennifer's doing and the work that we're trying to do in Michigan is really help people translate to that method that we've talked about of like, what is a quality assessment. This is something that Michigan Virtual actually does really well. And a lot of teachers are scared off by our courses because we actually have really good assessments. We're pretty good at that. And some people just want to show up and, as Justin said, click and get a training. So what's a quality assessment look like? There's a lot of people who have done their training face-to-face for years and now feel that they need to move into an online space, and it's kind of like mixed signals. They're not using the technology as an affordance to make the training that they do better. They're not using any sort of mindsets or frameworks to figure out how to translate. We help clients do that, and we help groups in Michigan think through that process. But I could see this move very quickly to having what we would often call free easy sketches or free easy CEUs, right? Like, oh, a competency-based microcredential is worth more CEUs than a regular Well, CEU is a seat time measurement, right? It's meant to honor the number of hours you sat in a chair. And as soon as you start offering them up really easily because somebody took a competency base, you're now devaluing all the other seat time work that's going on in face-to-face conferences and things like that. So those are kind of like two pitfalls that I see that we're on the cusp of negotiating and constantly trying to help people think through the implementation so that it has fidelity.
Chris, Justin, you guys want to pick up from there?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a specific pitfall, but I would love it if we kind of were to approach this entirely new concept with a lot more focus on research and fidelity, right? And trying to determine, whether or not these different innovative professional learning models really translate into like observable differences in classroom practices, in student achievement, what kind of instructional or other skills or competencies are really lending themselves best to this type of model rather than other types of professional learning models. Again, those aren't really specifics. I think they're more general in nature, but this is like a very innovative and new practice that we're all discussing, and I'd love to see more research being done and kind of grounding that practice and ensuring that quality as it grows and evolves.
So I'll add two pitfalls that we see. One is mandatory microcredentials. Microcredentials, from our view, as I mentioned at the beginning, really rooted in educator voice and choice, and moving towards a system that automatically requires educators to do X, Y, and Z microcredential is not going to honor that educator voice and choice in a meaningful way. The second that I think is a tremendous pitfall that education falls into immediately is saying, okay, we're doing this new thing. What is the impact on student test scores? I am a firm believer that we cannot even begin to have that conversation for several years once we've really hammered down questions around quality, scalability, assessment, implementation, incentives, et cetera, et cetera. I think we can start thinking about how microcredentials change educator satisfaction and self-perception, then start thinking about how it actually changes educator practice, then thinking about how it changes student perception, and then we could perhaps start having a conversation around more traditional student achievement measures. But we are, I think, a long time from doing that in the way that people tend to jump into almost immediately.
Interesting. Okay, so it's got to be about voice and choice, and maybe there aren't good, easily measurable ways of determining what the outcomes are. Chris, you want to add anything to that?
Well, it's, as has been already mentioned, I think this is a real great opportunity. We have to see if these are having any positive impact on teachers, right? This is what we're designing these all for, teachers. So if they're not having any measurable impact on them, then we should stop what we're doing. So I think that's a real important part of the why the assessing this, that keeping an eye on ourselves as we do this, or policing ourselves, is really critical to making sure that we're doing the right thing for teachers.
Okay, so making sure that we find some way of measuring whether we're doing the right thing by teachers, but maybe not necessarily immediately going to the question of, well, do those SAT scores go up or down? Making sure that we're focusing on voice and choice. Maybe these aren't. Someone said, I think online, maybe this isn't the new PD. In fact, I think Ryan said, we can't make micro-credentials the next way we do PD. It's kind of a provocative statement. So is that a way of saying we still have limitations that micro-credentials fill out, something that's been really missing? Voice, choice, honoring what kind of learning is going on, honoring informal learning. But maybe it's not the next version of PD across the board. Yes? No? Ken?
In Michigan, we don't see it as something that will eclipse the current state. We see it as supplement to what's currently happening, and we see it this discussion about what is PD actually being able to achieve. If there's any change in behavior with teachers, if it's actually any advantage, it constantly comes up, as Chris was pointing out, because we know that professional learning in general is not making as big of a impact as we were hoping after the billions of dollars that we spent over the last couple decades. And so using new models and being innovative and looking at ways in the technology, and I really see microcredentials as interlinked, and there's a lot of technological components that I think will make it become a really healthy ecosystem in the long run that just is really nascent and hasn't been built out yet. As the technology gets more advanced and we get predictive AI to help people figure out what they should be focusing on to improve their skills, we're gonna progress that way, and it's not going to be a flash in the pan. All of a sudden, everything shifts to this model. And so it's definitely a constant conversation of how do we manage both the old and the new.
That's a wonderful point. And I think the other point that I think Jennifer and Chris and y'all made at the beginning of this is that this is about the professionalization of educators. It's about treating them as professionals, of giving them opportunities to enhance their professional stature. It's about voice and choice. It's about filling out the learning, but it's not about checking the box. Any final observations? We've got just a couple of minutes here. We've had some phenomenal comments online, both in the chat boards and as well as in the questions. Bernie Trilling, who's a longtime expert, particularly in project-based learning, points out that for evaluating microcredentialing, triangulation is important. What teachers say they're planning on doing is important. The artifacts of their learning really matter, and then the reflections that they have. Ryan's pointing out transparency is key to implementing these things. Any last observation that any of you would like to remind people as we go down this path of understanding the different ways technology can support learning?
Yeah, I'd love to add one last thing, Betsy, here, particularly building off this idea of professionalizing the teacher profession, which is exceptionally tautological, but here we are, is that at the end of the day, we can think of microcredentials almost as like a digital portfolio that educators can collect. And through that portfolio, they're able to show to their colleagues, to their administrators, to their students, to the parents of their students, this is who I am, this is what I'm able to do as an educator. And that can be incredibly empowering for that educator. It can also be a wonderful human capital strategy across districts to be able to really know who you have in your building, what they bring to the table every day, and what they can support their peers in is really powerful. It's something that we don't really have today. So we're really talking about rethinking not just how educators learn, but how they are able to show who they are in their learning, and then support each other in the process. So it's a full cycle of learning that's possible here.
It's a great point. Chris?
Yeah, a couple things. We haven't really talked about it, but I see workforce development as being a potential driver for this. So as they get accepted perhaps more within the workforce, we might see a network effect then then affect education. And I'm reminded of, we weren't talking about MOOCs when they were developed by a couple Canadian folks, and then all of a sudden MIT Stanford adopts them, Coursera is born, and now MOOCs are cool. So, I think we have that kind of opportunity here as well. There might be a tipping point that'll tip our hand on this.
Excellent. Ken?
Are MOOCs really cool? I'm just so yeah, I think what I really like about microcredentials, and I think a big takeaway for me, is that they rely on partnerships, right? They rely on districts to recognize expertise. They rely on research. They rely on a lot of things that we currently have in the system, but not in a coherent manner. And I'm really, really looking forward to how the idea of a microcredential builds coherency for us.
Excellent. And Justin, any final thoughts here?
Sure, and I think we've touched on these things throughout the course of the presentation today, but microcredentials, I think we're all hoping is kind of like this this new innovative model that's going to be like the ideal version of like effective adult learning, andragogy as opposed to pedagogy, right? And how do we involve self-concept, voice and choice, and really like put learners and honor their expertise in their learning and trying to affect change in their own setting. So I think there's still a lot to sort out, as we've discussed. There's a lot for every answer we have a question as well, and something new to research and discuss. So,
well, I want to thank all of you very much for a very, very engaging conversation. I want to especially thank everybody who signed in online. Your comments, your questions really helped drive this conversation, and it was fantastic. I learned a lot. But particularly, I'd like to thank Jennifer Kabacher, who again is Director of Educator Microcredentials at Digital Promise, Chris Sessions of the Learning Strategies Consultancy and who works with D2L, Ken Durkin at the Michigan Virtual, and Justin Bruno, of course, also of Michigan Virtual. A very big thanks to D2L for sponsoring this presentation. It will be available again online. We can continue the conversation. I think we owe you a few more resources that we'll pull together. Again, my name is Betsy Corcoran. I'm with EdSurge, and I am very grateful to all of you for taking the time to really care about how we're learning, how educators are learning, and ultimately how we're motivating our students to learn, as one of our contributors here said. So thank you very much, and keep on learning. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.